The Second World War saw many weird and wonderful military vehicle types, and the Heinkel He was no exception. Hello everyone, I'm Matt, this is Model Minutes, and join me on the workbench today as I build and review the AZ model He Salamander in 1/72nd scale. For a deeper dive inside the box of this kit, take a look at the parts, decals and paint schemes, check out the dedicated unboxing video I've already made on that topic. In this one I'll be focusing on what this kit is like to build and rounding off with a review at the end. I'll pop a list of the products I used on the screen here to give you an idea of the kind of things you might want to go and get if you fancy replicating the results you see in this video. But without any further ado, let's get into it. As usual, I'll cut the parts that I need away from the sprue using my cutters and then sand away any flash or rough areas using my sanding stick. Although this is a 2022 tooling, it does have a ever so slight short run feel to the parts. Most of the parts do have some element of flash, mould seams are present, and they do require a little bit of work to get them in a good position for being used. My glue of choice throughout this build will be Tamiya Extra Thin Cement. And the first step was to glue together the front nose wheel gear bay. This also has the rudder pedals attached to either side of it for the pilot. The He was pretty small, and the nose wheel retracted between the pilot's feet. With that done, I moved on to assembling the various parts of the cockpit. Here we have a kind of floor support part, and the control column was glued onto this. Then I added the backrest onto the seat component and then glued this onto the rear bulkhead. Whilst there are some locating markers on some of the parts, there aren't that many, so there is a bit of trial and error to get things in the right places. The control column assembly I've already built could then be glued onto this bulkhead as well. And whilst that glue is curing, on the internal walls of the cockpit there are some control panel parts which need to be glued into place. With that done, the cockpit assembly was glued into the cockpit area on the fuselage. The control panel has a number of parts which need to be glued onto it, and when that was done it was also glued into the fuselage half. The nose wheel and rudder assembly I made earlier was then glued in as well. And now onto some painting. This Humbrol number 240, which is an RLM02 grey, was used straight out of the pot to paint all the internal areas. There isn't much in the way of a cockpit for this aircraft, and the cockpit that is present is pretty small, so a single coat of this paint should be sufficient to give the impression that the internal surfaces have some protective paint covering them. With that done, I would pick out some of the smaller details using some Humbrol 32 dark grey. This would include the control column, the control panel, and some of the control elements on the fuselage walls. You do get some decals to go inside the cockpit. There is one for the control panel and also some seat belts. There is quite a lot of decal film though, so I did trim this away to make sure that I could get this to fold around the seat correctly. I would soak the decals in warm water, and then some Mr. Hobby Mr. Mark Softer would be used to help soften them into the surface details. This decal setting solution was painted onto the relevant areas, the decal slid onto the part, and then carefully manipulated into the right place. A little bit more of the setting solution would further soften the decal onto the surface of the model. It's at this point that I'm pretty happy with my cockpit interior. I think it looks okay just to give the general impression, but I do need to make sure that I glue into place the reflector gun sight for the pilot. With that done, I'm going to turn my attention to the landing gear bay. So there is a single landing gear bay along the centre line of this aircraft, and it holds both main wheels. Annoyingly though, AZ Model have designed this in a number of components which have to be glued together, and there aren't that many locating marks to help you get them in the right places. I found this to be quite fiddly and a bit tedious, and I had to test the fit quite a few times and trim little bits of plastic away to get it to fit correctly. I think the details are quite nice, I'm just not enjoying this particular part of the process. When that was done, I glued this landing gear bay into the inside of the fuselage, and it's at this point I can add some nose weight. It does tell you in the instructions that you need to include 10 grams of nose weight inside of the model. This should help prevent it from sitting on its tail. I decided to mix up a kind of paste using some matte Mod Podge and some liquid gravity. I then applied this into the front of the aircraft and as far forwards of the main landing gear that I could get it. I'm hoping I've added enough in here, and it should change the centre of gravity so that it doesn't sit on its tail at the end. The turbine for the jet engine can then be glued in at the top of the aircraft, and the exhaust glued in at the rear. And with that done, I could join the two fuselage halves together. The fit of the parts is generally okay. There is a little bit of misalignment which might need a bit of sanding to clean it all up, but there are no locating pins or anything, so actually at this point you're pretty much going to have to just guess that it's in the right place. A little bit of sanding though does help to tidy it up a little bit, although towards the end of the build I do notice there is a bit of a seam along the top of the engine, but actually the cowling was designed to open at that point, so maybe it's not too inaccurate. After all, this is kind of a fictional aircraft anyway, as the C variant never actually went into production. Moving to the rear of the aircraft, there is a part here which needs to be glued in, which allows me to add the V-shaped tail. This is one of the modifications that the C variant had over the earlier A's and B's. With that done, I glued into place the wings. This variant of the HE162 has a swept wing, which is slightly different to the versions that were actually in production. The wings do have a locating pin to help you line them up, but I found the fit was a little bit questionable. I did have to hold them in place until the glue had cured. On the nose of the aircraft there is this probe, I presume this is the pitot tube. And then on the top is this little ring antenna. On the lower side I do need to add my own piece of plastic, this is a little bit of stretched sprue, to the landing gear bay. This kit does come with some optional underwing cannons, and I thought it would be pretty fun to include them. You do get the option of rockets if you'd prefer, but I thought this one would look good with the guns attached. Perhaps if I get a different version in the future, I'll add the rockets next time. Now moving on to the clear canopy. You get one single clear part for the canopy, and I used some Humbrol Clear Fix to glue it into place. I have previously masked this using my normal method, which is to apply tape and then cut it to shape around the canopy framework, which was reasonably simple. The Clear Fix glue should dry clear and strong without reacting with the plastic. And now onto some painting. First up I'm going to use this Outlaw Red to paint the air intake, which I will add at the end of the build, and also the red band on the rear of the fuselage. The next paint would be Humbrol 25, which is a blue colour, and this would be sprayed onto the other part of the banding on the tail, so that I've got a two-colour tail band. I've already masked the red, and when the blue was dry, I would mask that as well. And then it was time to prime. I've been enjoying the Army Painter Black Primer recently. It just does the job it needs to do. This was sprayed onto the aircraft, and also the other elements which have not yet been added onto the model. This should give a nice uniform base for the subsequent layers of paint to stick to. And speaking of the paint, I'm going to go with this Vallejo Light Blue RLM 65. This was loaded into the airbrush with a small amount of thinner just to help prevent any tip dry. It was then airbrushed onto the external surfaces of the landing gear bay covers, which have not yet been added to the aircraft, and also all of the lower sides of the model. I'm not too fussed about doing any pre-shading here. This is a bit of a mojo kind of weekend build, so I just want a nice uniform colour. After this, Vallejo RLM 83 dark green was loaded into the airbrush and applied to the upper surfaces. I haven't done any masking here, I'm just going to apply it completely freehand, using this as a bit of a practice for my modelling skills. So the marcation between the upper and lower surfaces would be done by carefully applying the paint using the airbrush, and then I would also do a bit of modelling. The final colour for the camouflage scheme is this violet brown RLM 81. I have masked up the splinter camouflage on the upper surfaces so that I get some nice neat straight edges. But for the sides of the fuselage where it meets the lower blue colour, I will do a bit more modelling. I definitely need more practice with modelling, but I think this looks a little bit better than the ME262 that I built last year. Every model kit is a chance to improve your skills. With that done, I carefully peeled away my homemade masks, and they seem to be doing a pretty good job. There is no bleed that I need to clean up, which means I can move on to the next steps. This gunmetal paint was carefully used on the turbine, inside the jet engine on the top of the aircraft, and also the cannon barrels on the guns on the wings and the fuselage sides. It would also be used to carefully paint the engine exhaust area, which I did freehand, just following the panel lines as a guide. The RLM02 that I used earlier makes a reappearance here, and this was painted onto the internal surfaces of the landing gear bay covers and also all of the landing gear leg elements. I would carefully apply it to the hubs of the wheels as well, and then move on to just hand paint it into the landing gear bay areas on the model itself. I did this carefully by hand, taking my time to make sure I didn't get it on any of the camouflage areas where it wasn't meant to go. And now I can turn my attention to decals. So you get 3 decal schemes in this kit, but as you can see there aren't that many. I think for my particular decal scheme I only need 12 of these. I identified the ones that I wanted and cut them from the sheet. It is worth noting that there is some excess decal film which you might have to cut away if there are any decals which are joined together accidentally. Soaking them in warm water should help release them from the backing paper ready for application, and if you're like me and keep getting your cup of tea mixed up with your brush water, why not get yourself a brush water mug? It helps support the channel. I would use a little bit of water to help apply the decals onto the surface of the model, and then some of the Mr. Softer decal setting solution would make a reappearance and help soften them into all the surface details. This particular decal application fluid works really well on this type of decal, almost melting them into the surface with only a couple of thin applications. As mentioned, there aren't that many decals, and they went on relatively easy. Yes, they do have a little bit of excess decal film, and they are perhaps a little bit thin, so you do have to be careful that they don't fold over whilst you're applying them, but this was a relatively straightforward step. Maybe the registration on the number 8 with the white around the outside isn't quite perfect, but for the most part actually the decal application process was really easy and I quite enjoyed it, making quick progress and the setting solution allowing these decals to blend into the surface really nicely. With the decals done, I would carefully add the remaining elements to the aircraft. So this included the red part of the engine nacelle which I painted earlier, and then flipping over to the other side of the model I would add the landing gear legs. Once again, this is a little bit fiddly. Although they do have mounting points, it is a little bit trial and error getting them in the right place. It is possible to do so, but it did take me a little while and some of it I had to do off camera. There are some little support arms as well which need to go in here, and I'm not sure I got them in quite the right place, so I'm pretty much putting them where I think they look okay. The nose landing gear is again a little bit along the same vein, just pushing it into where it kind of seemed to fit. But the main wheels were relatively straightforward to add onto the axles of the landing gear legs. The gear bay covers was another straightforward step, gluing them onto the edges making sure to put the right ones on the right side. Of course, not forgetting to add the one for the nose gear bay as well. And with all of those steps done, it's time to add some protective paint. This custom service satin varnish was loaded into the airbrush and sprayed over the entire aircraft. This should help seal in those decals that I applied earlier and protect them in the next stages. I'm going to do a tiny little bit of weathering, and my wash of choice at the moment is this Humbrol blue-grey enamel number 79 thinned down with some white spirit. I find this gives quite a nice subtle effect and brings out some of those recessed details. I thinned it down until it was diluted as much as I like it to be, and it was painted over the entire aircraft. I didn't actually need to remove any excess wash, as I thinned it to a point where it kind of just accumulated in all of the recessed details whilst not leaving the flat surfaces looking a bit dirty. So I left that to dry, and then when I returned to the model, this XW1 Ultra Matte from K Colors was loaded into the airbrush and sprayed over the entire aircraft. This is going to dull down that slightly satin finish that it has and blend everything together, making it look a lot more uniform. With that done, I'm going to carefully peel away my homemade canopy masks, which have done a pretty good job, and fortunately in this build I've got no canopy fogging. And it would be at this point that normally I would consider my build complete, but unfortunately when I put this down on the desk, it turns out that the nose weight I've included doesn't seem to be enough. It is a tail sitter. But oh well, I have a solution to this problem. I'm going to swing back to my old faithful method of gluing it onto a display base. So what I've got here is a coaster which I've painted in black and then done a homemade tarmac kind of effect on the top. There are a few oil and fuel spills which I think add a little bit of visual interest. Some super glue would be used to glue this onto the base, and then for just a bit more visual interest, a couple of suitable figures. These are from the Airfix 176 scale Luftwaffe personnel set, and whilst they might be ever so slightly a touch too small, I think they just help add a little bit of extra weight to this particular model. And with that, I am actually going to call this build complete. And that's another build under the belt. So I think I'm going to do what I've been doing recently, which is where I talk about the negative aspects first and then round off with the more positive parts of the kit. So I don't think that AZ Model are short run manufacturers. I think they are more of a mainstream company, but this kit does have a slight feeling of being short run. I say that because there is quite a bit of flash, some of the design of the parts is not necessarily as intelligent as I would have anticipated from a fairly new tooling, and also things just need a little bit of work to get them in the right place. That being said though, on a slightly more positive note, the level of detail is actually quite nice from the plastic parts that you are given. The decals did have some excess decal film around them, and I did have to cut that away in a few places just to make sure things would conform, but the decals are generally pretty good. I did find this build a little bit tedious and a little bit of a struggle in a few places, but it didn't put me off and I actually quite enjoyed the build. Perhaps a final thing that wasn't so good about this kit is the fact that I didn't put enough nose weight in. That's potentially my fault, but there is a tiny space in the front to get 10 grams in. I don't think it's necessarily enough space, but I'd have to rebuild it again to see if I could actually do that. But my solution, to put it onto a display base, kind of fixed that problem and no one will ever know. So those were the more negative aspects of the kit, which if you think, okay, it needed a little bit of extra work to make it, come out of the box and be constructed, it's not too bad of a kit. If you're willing to put a little bit of extra time in just to get things to fit correctly, then I think this could be quite a good kit to have on the workbench for a weekend. And actually I do keep a note of everything I do in my modelling journals. These are books I've written or created to help keep a track of my own builds on the workbench, and you can get your own copies to keep a track of your own builds too if you check out the links in the description. In here I did actually note down that this took me 2 days, so this is perfect for a weekend build, and I primarily wanted to experience something a little bit fun, a little bit different, and also practice my mottling and camouflage painting techniques with the airbrush. The positive aspects of this kit are that I love that it comes with 3 different decal schemes. Granted, this is a fictional aircraft. The HE-162C never actually went into production, but it was going to be supposedly a variation on the original HE-162. It had these rearward swept wings, a V tail, and also apparently it was going to have the guns in the top of the plane so that when it flew underneath a bomber, they would shoot upwards. It doesn't appear to be something that's modelled in this kit, but it was something that was proposed for this variant of the aircraft. The instructions were relatively easy to follow, and the painting instructions being in full colour made it pretty easy to understand what I needed to do and where I needed to do it. Maybe some slight improvements to this kit could be to include an open cockpit canopy and a raised landing gear option, although I actually think that the raised landing gear option could be done by cleaning up the landing gear bay covers a little bit, and then they might fit into those bays quite well. So if you wanted this in a flying pose, it probably wouldn't be too difficult to achieve. So this is a 2022 tooling as indicated on the box, and whilst I did expect it to be a slightly higher quality than it was, it actually wasn't that bad, and I didn't hate the build. I actually had quite a lot of fun in different areas during the construction of this project. There have been a number of different releases of this kit, so if you want something obscure, a fictional little plane to mess about with, and in a variety of different paint schemes, AZ have actually got you covered. Another thing quite good about this is that it has a reasonably low recommended retail price. At the time I'm making this video, the recommended retail price was £12.99 in euros, which if I convert to GBP at the time of editing, it's about £11.20. But actually, you can pick these up for a little bit cheaper. I picked up mine for just under £9, which makes it considerably better value. Perhaps for the RRP you are asking a little bit too much, but it is a slightly obscure kit, and I don't think it's necessarily too overpriced, but for the price that I paid for it, it was definitely better value. So yeah, I think to kind of wrap this one up, this is a kit that will need a little bit of work to get it into a reasonably good position. There were some bits of the build which I didn't really enjoy, but after a little bit of work and fiddling with the parts, I managed to get things where I wanted them. I do particularly like how I managed to do the paint scheme, and I really enjoyed having that extra opportunity to practice my modelling skills. And as I mentioned earlier, I do think this looks a little bit better than the ME262 I built last year. So yeah, on the whole, I think if you wanted a weekend project to mess around with, perhaps try out some new skills and techniques, and ultimately end up with a pretty fun and unique fictional aircraft on your display shelf, you couldn't go too far wrong with this particular model. And with that, I'm going to call this video here. Let me know down in the comments what you thought of my build and whether my assessment of this kit was fair. Don't forget that we have a Model Minutes Model Club, and if you'd like to join the Model Club and get exclusive access to early videos and other perks, check out the links in the description. Massive thanks to these Model Club members on the screen for the extra support they give the channel, allowing me to create consistent content. I'd like to welcome our latest member to the club, Ian Butler. Thanks for joining us. There are other ways to help support the channel if you'd prefer, but the best way to support the channel for free is by subscribing with notifications turned on so you never miss a modelling upload. Finally though, last thing to say is a massive thank you to you for watching this one, and I'll catch you on the workbench again next time.